show today, Lucie Wilk, so holistic doctor, all things, well, let's just get into it. Lucie, welcome. Nice to meet you.
Thank you. Nice to meet you too, Mark. Lovely to be here. Thanks.
I love to hear a bit about people's kind of personal journeys, what you've got you interested in kind of functional medicine and this kind of more holistic way of looking at the body that you seem to be into now.
Yeah. So it was a long journey. I started out in allopathic medicine and did the usual pretty intensive training. And training is all acute care. It's in the hospital. We're looking after people who are very, very unwell, and the impact we have is pretty clear. You know, I didn't question the benefits of the care that I was providing when I was in training. It was only when I got out of training and I began to practice as a rheumatologist. That was what I ended up training in. And I saw a lot of chronic illness. Rheumatology is mostly chronic disease. So it was in that setting when it became abundantly clear that it just wasn't working. There was so much that we were missing, and it was a lot of, I'm sure you've heard this all before, but trading symptoms for side effects, a lot of just juggling medication, but never really finding the right combination, not really addressing the underlying problems. So yeah, I got quite disillusioned actually. And I on a couple of occasions tried to leave medicine. I just really didn't feel like I was providing any benefit at all. I was trying to understand what the root cause was. I thought there was sort of social demographic issues, and it was kind of, and a lot of emotional issues that we weren't addressing, but I didn't really have a good handle on it back then. And then I stumbled across functional medicine actually, and it was really the perfect gateway to taking that step into finally addressing the root cause rather than, you know, slapping a plaster on symptoms, which is what I felt I'd been doing for the past bunch of years.
All right, Lucie, just a few terms. So allopathic sounds like psychopathic. That's what like sort of the average non-hippie would call kind of normal medicine, right?
Normal medicine, yeah.
Normal medicine.
Conventional, if you want to call it that. You know, what you get when you pitch up to your normal doctor. Yeah.
What does it mean, allopathic, out of interest? I've heard the term a few times. I'm actually fairly ignorant about this topic, so feel free to start with the very basics here, and then some of the listeners will be with me and others will maybe join in later. So yeah, what does that mean, allopathic? What defines conventional other than it's what's normally done?
Really interesting question. I've never really pondered. I've just sort of grabbed hold of the term just to sort of use it in contrast to anything that sort of strays from the usual approach. I mean, I think it's just what has taken over mainstream, I guess you could call it as well. It's the approach to healthcare that our society has been engaging with for probably about 100 years. So it's very closely tied to pharmaceuticals. That's sort of and surgery. Those are our two kind of interventions that we have to offer people. So that's what kind of conventional standard allopathic medicine relies on, I would say. Usually those two types of interventions. And if there's anything else required, we sort of reach to other healthcare professionals for support.
And I guess pathology is kind of at the root of that, isn't it? Like what's wrong, there's kind of an illness, and then it's defined, and then it's treated with a medicine, usually of some kind, usually a kind of chemical medicine. Occasionally something else like physiotherapy might be involved, but they're sort of giving a pill is the kind of normal, or a pill or a cut, an operation. I guess they're the kind of main things people look to.
Yeah, take it out or suppress it. Yeah, that's sort of the general approach. And yeah, pharmaceuticals, sort of biochemical manipulation to sort of attain some sort of, I guess it's sort of a false homeostasis. You know, our body's always trying to maintain a certain homeostasis, and when pathology happens, it's slipped out of homeostasis and it hasn't been able to get back in balance. So the pharmaceuticals basically just help kind of give a semblance of balance to stave off, you know, significant problems in pathology. But really, not addressing the root cause at all, but more suppressing symptoms. I liked, there's a metaphor I quite like when contrasting the two approaches. And it's, if you can imagine that there's a sink and the taps are turned open full and water streaming out of the faucet, filling up the sink. So if the water is the symptoms and the problems and the pathology, and the water sort of filling up the sink and spilling out onto the floor, the allopathic or conventional approach is to provide various forms of mops to kind of mop up the mess and clean it up. So that's sort of the general conventional approach. And the functional approach is to see how we can turn off the taps, look at for what are the reasons these taps have been, wide open for the past number of years. And we also accept that this is something that's accumulated over a long period of time. So the problem, the imbalance has been going on for a long time before it manifests in really, overt disease problems.
Okay, so again, the very basics, functional medicine. Now, I've seen a functional medicine doctor with some stomach problems last year. So I've seen one who was a sort of traditional doctor, as it were, and then did a kind of another training on top of that. And they seem to be much more interested in things like diet, stress levels, trauma, social systems, well-being generally, rather than, okay, here's a pill for your stomach problem. Like, is my kind of single experience. It was a very lovely lady, by the way. Well, yeah. I appreciate them very much. Lots of time as well, get to know me and personalize, which I thought was, much nicer than the 10 minutes I get in the NHS doctor, who's different every week when I go to the surgery. Yeah. Is that a fairly typical experience that they would sort of, relate to you and ask you about all these factors and look at all those factors?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the typical first appointment is usually quite long. It's usually an hour to an hour and a half. And again, we accept that there are a number of factors that are all kind of aligning to create the problem. So we look all the way back to the very beginning, and we look at predisposing factors like genetics, family history, impacts at birth, those kinds of things, and then we look at triggers that might have something really came in and upset the balance, and then we look at are there any aspects of the environment that are continuing to perpetuate this problem. Really what it is it's looking at the body as it's a mammalian organism that's running on an ancestral evolutionary code, and this evolutionary code has been with our species for millions of years, and we accept that we've evolved to thrive within a certain quality of environment. And over the last very short period of time, actually, if you look at our whole history, our environment has changed quite dramatically, and our evolutionary code is exactly the same. So functional medicine sort of accepts that we've got a very different environment that's creating certain stressors and challenges on how our body is meant to thrive on these ancestral programs. So we look at all the factors in the environment that could be creating that distress. Usually it's too much of something or not enough of something, or behaviors that are discordant with our evolutionary code, like the way we move, our posture, the way we sit, how much we sit or stand, how much stress we have. Those are all the factors, environmental factors that we look into to determine, what's tipping us out of balance.
Lucy, sometimes I wonder if we're not just fundamentally screwed, to use a technical term, in that we're just so different. The modern context is so different. I'm 13 floors up on a MacBook, now, taking notes on my iPhone, drinking a protein shake, made of God knows what. And I don't know any of the people around me. They speak other languages, and I, try and get to the park, I get some exercise and meditate. I do a lot of good things, I try and keep some good friendships. But it's a pretty different context I'm in, isn't it, than what we evolved for. I kind of wonder if there's any hope at all, given that huge mismatch that the average, unless you're kind of living on an organic farm in Devon or something, it's pretty tricky to be anything like our context that we evolved for.
Absolutely. I mean, and this is why we're running into the problems we're running into. It's showing up. All of these stressors and all of this discordance is is manifesting. Chronic illness is, rampant. It's what I think 86% of kind of hospital care is from chronic disease. So you're absolutely right. We're living in a way that is completely discordant with the way we've evolved to thrive. So that's how we look at it from a just looking at us as a mammalian body. How do we help this body be healthy in a very different environment from what it was evolved to thrive within? But I personally like to take it even further to say, all right, we're not just meant to function optimally as this kind of biologic organism that's essentially a mammal. We're human, and there's a whole different element to what we're here to do and how we're meant to evolve and thrive. So that's a whole different focus that I think is as important as just fixing the disruptors in our environment by the quality of the food and the quality of our social environment, and how much time we spend on tech and all that sort of thing.
The other thing I've become aware of recently is sort of traditional medicine names things, and that sounds like a solution. So I had this gut thing and I had some symptoms for that, and then the doctors were like, okay, you've got this. They gave it a long name, and I went, okay, how does that help? Like, you've just given a name to a couple of symptoms I've got, or particularly in the sort of mental health space. I work in Ukraine around trauma, and someone was saying, but that's not PTSD. I'm like, PTSD is just a fucking name that got invented in the 70s that sort of fits around the number of symptoms. And if you don't have enough trauma symptoms, or you have the wrong trauma symptoms, you're not labeled as having PTSD. But that naming something doesn't actually explain it at all. It just sounds good. Do you know what I mean?
Describes it. It just describes it. Yeah, in a posh way, exactly. I mean, as a rheumatologist, one of the conditions I see a lot of is inflammatory arthritis, and inflammatory arthritis sounds like a complex name that describes a certain pathology, but basically it's just saying what your symptoms are, which is inflammation in the joints. Arthritis, itis is inflammation. Arth refers to the joint. So it's basically just describing your symptoms back to you with some pseudo-Latin terminology. So yeah,
right. It's swollen. It doesn't say like there's a bacteria called Fred and we treat it with this drug. It doesn't really explain why I might have it.
Doesn't explain why, and that's one of the questions most people ask when I'm sitting in the clinic with people is, well, why? How did this happen? Why? And my kind of conventional rheumatology answer is only, well, it's a combination of your genetic predisposition and some element in the environment that triggered it, which we can't really qualify and put our finger on. So it's a very vague answer, and it really basically takes away all agency from the patient. So they're left with a name, a syndrome that they take on as an identity. I have this condition. It's me, and they also are all agency is removed. So they don't have any idea that there's anything they can do about it, because they don't know how it developed. If you don't understand the why and the how, you can't make any changes. So that's the conventional allopathic approach, which it's frustrating on both sides. It's hard for us, and it's even harder for the patient.
I heard this in your TED talk about sort of agency lacking. You're saying that you write books, and in one of the books you've made the mistake of saying the normal people have agency and your lead character hadn't, and that was apparently a mistake in writing. But that's the mistake that's made central to medicine, isn't it? That you're a victim of things, you have no choices.
Yeah,
and then
exactly.
It's like you want operation A or B, maybe is the only choice someone might get.
Yeah,
and all the studies show that's terrible for people, right? Like having no agency. Exactly,
and it's unnatural to us. This isn't our natural way. We don't just passively wander around the world and things happen to us. But this is this is the story we're given in medicine, is that, this assault on your body happened from within, so you almost feel like a victim of your own body. And then to make matters worse, you're sort of victimized by the treatment too, which can be quite invasive and disruptive and upsetting as well. So it's sort of, the patients feel victimized by the condition, and then they feel, a victim to the system, as it were. They're at the mercy of the healthcare practitioners, and it's, I feel quite responsible for a system that's educated people into this situation where they feel helpless with their own bodies.
It seems like events of the last few years, which due to the Californian electronic overlords algorithms, we probably shouldn't name, because otherwise this would be shadow banned on YouTube and demonetized. Not we don't get much income from these. Did make a lot of people question the wider kind of systemic process of medicine. So wherever anyone listened to this falls on their pro this or anti that, the context made people go, hang on a minute, medicine's part of a wider system. There's a political system, and it's integral to that, and always has been, but just has been very obviously the last few years. And then it got linked to people's ability to travel or to work or leave their homes, quite a lot of pretty fundamental things, And again, rightly or wrongly, you can have an opinions different way. I'm kind of not hardcore either way, to be honest. And I can see both sides. But it got linked to all these sort of very fundamental things politically and also economically. There were a lot of people saying, hey, there's a lot of companies making some real money here. And maybe that's not neutral. Maybe those companies have a say and can donate to political parties. Maybe.
What are you on about?
20 years ago, I remember listening to Bill Hicks, the comedian, and those things sounded like crazy fringe kind of things to say at the time, And now I feel like a lot of people have woken up to that. But it also leaves us just going, this kind of postmodern condition of just like, who do I trust? Because the doctor was always like, I remember, the family doctor, I always trusted. My dad took the wrong medicine for epilepsy for 25 years. Wow. It seriously affected his health and his career and everything else, because he just trusted the local village family doctor, down at the surgery, down in the little town we lived in. Never got a second opinion. It was only when Google became a thing, and my dad learned to use it at 65, that he Googled what he was taking, and it was like, yeah, you shouldn't be on this. This is totally wrong. They went to another doctor and they were like, yeah, you shouldn't be on this. And he's not the suing kind, but he certainly could have done. So it's like we've lost that kind of trust in pharmaceutical companies, doctors. I've got friends with doctors, and they say it's a nightmare now because everyone turns up with a printout from Google. And we're in a very different world.
Yeah, I think that's good. I think that there is a turning tide. You're absolutely right. That was already beginning before the last couple of years. So people were starting to ask questions. People were starting to research. People were, beginning to question authority. And I say hallelujah, because I think one of the big dysfunctional elements of this medical system is the trust in authority, and it's so hierarchical. And even as a doctor, you're obligated to trust the political kind of health authority, because they're a few rungs up, and in that hierarchical system, there's this obligation to stop thinking independently. And so as doctors, we have to stop thinking independently because a higher authority has said so. And then as patients, supposed to stop thinking independently because you know what I mean? Like it sort of goes all the way down the hierarchy, and it is incredibly dysfunctional. And I think people are starting to challenge that and push back and start to say, hang on a minute, this doesn't make sense to me, and touch in with their kind of authentic voice that often has been completely suppressed for a very long period of time. They're finally sort of honoring it and speaking up. And I have to say, unfortunately, doctors don't often do that. But patients are more and more, and I think
But
it's
doctors aren't
fabulous.
rewarded in their training for that, are they really? I mean, imagine a young medic kind of, on the way up doing their training. I can't imagine they're rewarded for bucking against things.
For challenging. No, yeah, you're absolutely right. We are as a profession, we're professional order followers, right? That's how we got into medicine. We were super good at it. We nailed it. We in school we were told what they wanted us to do, and we did it perfectly. And so that's sort of how we ended up in the field of medicine. And so that kind of obedience to authority is sort of built into the professional structure, which I think creates all sorts of problems and might be playing into what's been happening over the last couple of years, but we don't need to get into that.
You can if you want, just got to be careful. In terms of, it's a crazy situation actually, that there's some sort of major thing that's completely relevant to what we're talking about. And it's tricky to discuss if I want to remain on kind of the major platforms. That's another level of authority that's there now. And things that there's been U-turns on, or, if there's at one point you would have been deplatformed for saying that there's potential lab leak in China. Then it was like, no, actually, there's a pretty good evidence case for that. That changed. A load of people lost their platforms for saying something. Which it's all very bizarre, and everyone's kind of like walking around it.
Yeah. No, and I think your earlier point is a good one too. That there is an inbuilt conflict of interest and potential for corruption just in the pharmacomedical industry. That's always been there. It's been quietly kind of humming along, and it's only in the last few years that has become really dramatized.
People are aware of it now in a way
that's it's
normal people whose job it is.
You can't look away anymore. Exactly.
It's their big stuff. And do you think doctors are getting more open-minded? I mean, I know a few groovy ones. Shout out to my good friend Dr. Rob, who's out there. Some groovy ones in Brighton who are, working within the NHS. They're in the system, as it were, but, they meditate on the side, and maybe, they've studied some things that maybe, I don't know, supplementation or stress reduction or trauma. I remember my friend who's a doctor sent me a Gabor Mate video. He had that film out a year or so back. It was really good. And he said, oh, you might like this guy. I was like, Rob, I've been trying to tell you about this for the last 5 years. Like someone comes along who's a doctor and all of a sudden it's allowed. But it does seem like my friend, very, very lovely man, very open, very open-minded. It does seem like there's an opening beginning to happen in the medical world.
Yeah, I agree. I think especially in primary care. So I'm in secondary care. So there's less thinking outside the box.
You just want to define that for our non-UK listeners.
Oh, yeah. So primary care is the person that you would go to first for any health problems. So that could be what you might call a general practitioner or a family doctor. And then secondary care is basically hospital-based care, specialty services and that sort of thing. So yeah, I think in the primary care, the people who are more interacting with people and see the impact of lifestyle and the impact of trauma, they are the people who are going to be starting to think this way. And again, the tide is really turning, and it's quick. It's happening very quickly. But secondary care seems to be still in a little bit of a silo. There's less of that, a lot less of it actually. But that said, I gave a grand round talk a few years ago on the principles of functional medicine, which we also call lifestyle medicine over here in the UK. And there was a lot of agreement and interest from a whole bunch of specialists, who have their sort of niche medical problems that they specialize in. Everybody acknowledged the elephant in the room, the impact of lifestyle on people's health conditions.
Do you think the sort of trauma narrative, I mean, that's, a big part of my world and studies and work. I mean, is that catching on as something that is pretty influential? Because it just seems to be a factor in, like I just spoke to someone in Ukraine and they were talking about women's gynecological issues, and a doctor working with that said since the war started, there's been all kinds of sort of cervix conditions he hasn't seen before. There's been all kinds of stress-related stuff related. And this doctor was completely confused because he's a gynecologist. And he was like, well, why the last 6 months have I been seeing all these conditions and all this and all this that, things that used to be rare? And kind of like I was passing on to my friend to talk to him and say, look, with trauma, you can get some pretty strong symptomization. And it's not really surprising that women in Ukraine, where there's been sexual violence and this kind of thing, it's showing up in some strong ways. I'm wondering if the kind of knowledge of trauma is kind of becoming a bit more common in the medical world now.
I think it's very early days for it to be hitting the medical world on the conventional side. However, those of us who are practicing sort of on the alternative side, if you want to call it holistic, integrative, increasingly so. Functional medicine doesn't focus on that. It really does look at sort of manipulatable, like the sort of mechanical things that we can modify, like food, nutrition. Those are the sorts of things we can grab hold of and change. And there's biochemistry, and it all feels very kind of, something that you can. There's a cause and effect that you can measure. Trauma is less addressed in that model, but some of us, led by the pioneers in this area, are really starting to understand that that's in my view more important than getting the environment right. So the way I see it is that if the inherent patterns in the system, so if someone has been traumatized and they are in this kind of ancestral survival defense response, and they are operating on that system, and under that system, their nervous system is going to be set to assume that there's risk and threat. So if we're trying to improve the food or improve the environment, when a system is set to kind of defending against imminent threat, then we only get so far. Or you have to be hyper careful about everything in the environment. And that's one of the mistakes people make in functional medicine, is trying to perfect it, like have the absolute perfect diet. You can't, you can't
gluten-free, you end up dairy-free, everything free.
It goes to an extreme where people get really paranoid about having the absolute, it's like tippy-toeing around a kind of agitated system. But if we can recognize that the system is agitated for a reason, and then we start to explore that and heal that, then a calm system that feels safe in a kind of benign or even loving world, that system will be able to engage with anything in the environment and it won't react. So that's, in my view, the more kind of true healing. And
there's a limitation to just kind of lifestyle stuff there, right? There's something a bit more fundamental.
I agree 100%. Yeah, exactly. And so you could get a certain distance with lifestyle and changing and optimizing nutrition. And for lots of people, that's a really important first step because it hasn't been taken at all. But once you've got that far, then there's a lot more work to do on all of these elements that are creating a kind of agitated, defensive, nervous, and hormonal system. Yeah.
Do you think there's a sort of crisis point coming in the UK and many countries in that it looks like the system's falling apart a bit? Like the NHS is under ridiculous strain. I can't get an appointment with a doctor. When I do, it's rushed. They're just trying to get me out the door. It just seems, and then in the wider world, there's, big kind of financial issues. Mental health is the worst I've ever seen it. I mean, if I walk through the centre of Brighton, I will walk by 10 people who have, in the middle of the day, if I walk 15 minutes, I say to my gym, I just walk 15 minutes back from my gym, I saw at least 10 people that clearly had mental health or drug addiction problems.
Yeah.
Like some who may be homeless, some who weren't. And I must have walked past another 50 people who are just quietly suffering from anxiety and trauma and all the other things, medicated, And it just seems like we're hitting some sort of critical mass of crazy. Plus, kind of economically, like I feel like if I don't take care of my own health and have some resources and know a herbalist and these kind of things, like I'm in trouble, right? Like I can't rely on the system is the kind of sense I'm getting now.
Yeah, yeah, it is on its knees. It's been struggling for a long time, and the last few years have really, been the final kind of spear, as it were. So it's and perhaps though is what we need to recognize that it's a system that was operating on kind of wrong principles for the chronic problems. I think it's brilliant for acute illness, and can't criticize acute care. It does what it needs to do, but the burden of chronic illness is enormous, and it's, as you say, getting even worse. And I think it just speaks to the amount of trauma. And I think there's also this factor of the burden of trauma literally increases generation after generation. And it really does feel like we're at a tipping point where there is so much suffering. And even a generation ago, even if people had sort of this kind of quietly suppressed trauma, they could still have a relatively normal life, and we could ignore it. But now it's so clear and so present that we can't look away. And again, I think that's the invitation to heal, for the first time, because when it's quietly suppressed and we can keep going, then we don't need to. To just get on with it and live our lives the way we think we want to live them. But when it's so apparent and it's so disruptive, and there's so much obvious suffering, and physically, emotionally, that's the invitation. So I see it as actually it's a stepping stone that will get us to a better place. It's going to be a painful, birthing process, as it were, where we have to kind of go through the leaving of an old system that isn't working anymore, before we and kind of feel the pain of that before we can birth something new.
Yeah, my sense is maybe like if I think of growing up in the 80s in the countryside in England, this kind of monocultural environment, there was quite a lot of stability. And I had friends who, most of the people who were quite poor, but there wasn't kind of grinding poverty there. And the levels of mental health, like I knew most of the people in the like large village, small town I grew up in, and they knew each other. And there was like, one crazy guy who was sort of kind of walked down the street shouting and things, but was pretty benign. And, other people would kind of help make sure that person didn't walk in front of cars and things. But this isn't some Garden of Eden. It certainly wasn't paradise. There could have been all sorts of things behind closed doors. But my sense was there was enough stability that it kind of held together somehow. And there wasn't the sort of crazy making factors we have now, whether that be tech, whether that be just a degree of instability in various things. It's like we're not going to get away with it anymore,
Yeah, exactly. I think you're right. I think we can't get away with it anymore. And it's sort of exponential. The escalation has been really dramatic in our lifetimes. I agree. I kind of started out, and it was you could kind of keep that kind of pastoral element of normalcy. Everything seemed okay, and there was still a decent amount of social connectivity because it was pre-tech, and now, yeah.
That's a huge one, isn't it? The social connect, like in terms of our well-being, it seems to be one of the most important factors.
Yeah, so there's a statistic that I love to share that of all of the factors that create illness, so morbidity and mortality, illness and death, the leading issue is social isolation. It actually is more powerful predictor and a factor in disease and death than all the other ones. So more important than drinking too much alcohol, smoking, physical inactivity. all of these other risk factors that we kind of accept as things that put us at risk for poor health, social isolation beats all of them in terms of how powerful an impact it has on us. And if you think about it, again, it's ancestral, isn't it? We're a tribal species. We come from a history where if we were wandering around by ourselves, we wouldn't survive. So we needed to be, and we co-regulate each other, exactly. So there's some elements to our species that are inbuilt for security, and as you say, that kind of not just being amongst the tribe, but having that co-regulation between members of a group is an important part of us knowing that we feel safe.
It's funny with these kind of warning labels on the back of cigarette packets or maybe alcohol in some countries, and imagine every time you turned on Facebook there was a government warning, sort of lack of proper friends in the real world may seriously damage your health. Every time you turned on Facebook, a big advert. But
maybe someday.
I mean, we laugh, but I think we're not taking seriously the things that are damaging well-being. You know what I mean? Like we're really not seeing what those factors are.
I mean, you could argue that we're more connected in some ways, but I think there's essential elements of feeling connected aren't there because of the distance. We don't have that electromagnetic heart field to heart field nervous system co-regulation that sort of, again, that generates that feeling of safety and attunement. We don't have any of that when we link up with someone on tech.
Who you can get a hug from, and if it's a distance relationship, it's like, well, is this someone you could call at 2 a.m. when you need to talk? And if it's not a friend. It's something else. It's an electronic acquaintance, which might be great. I'm glad I've got electronic acquaintances, but broadens my net. I get to speak to interesting people like you on the other side of the country. I was on the phone to an employee in Australia this morning. It's fantastic. But unless those people are people I can call at 2 a.m. and get a hug on, and they'll help you move house. There's another one. I'm moving house soon. And I thought, how many people do I know in Brighton, even though I lived here 15 years, that would come and help me move boxes?
Yeah.
And there weren't very many. There's a few. Do you know what I mean? I was just at the gym, and I know the names of no more than 2 or 3 people in that gym. And I've been going to that gym regularly for a year.
No, I think things have changed so much, haven't they? And yet, you're communicating with how many people, through tech? Probably thousands.
Every day, someone worked it out for me once. It's several. It's over 10,000 a day. It's some kind of communication. This podcast has had over 1 million downloads over 3 years. So just the podcast alone, just the audio, just do the maths on that. 1 million divided by 1,000, that would be how many a day, more or less, on this podcast. And then there's all the other, the Facebook, the Instagram, all the rest. But
so it's quite the paradox, isn't it?
Is there anything in regard to this kind of topic we haven't talked about yet that you think is kind of really key in terms of allopathic medicine, functional medicine, alternatives, sort of a deeper approach to healing? We jumped around quite a lot. So is there anything that you want to cover here that listeners would probably find useful?
Yeah, so I think what increasingly I'm kind of recognizing and spending more time on is understanding that it isn't just about manipulating the environment to get our health back in order, that there are deeper elements to our imbalance and, if you want to call it dis-ease. So there are we have to recognize that we can't kind of get in balance and heal if we don't look into those deeper parts of us. So the analogy I would use is, I guess first of all to say that what it really comes down to is how safe do we feel? It really comes down to this binary system of, are we safe in the world? And that's because most of the time we're sort of running on these ancestral defense programs. And when our bodies give us symptoms and tell us that something's out of balance, it's giving us information, and it's generally telling us most of the time that we're not safe, and we're managing that threat in a certain way. So the symptoms are just giving us information about, what the body is engaged with and interacting with. So if we sort of use the analogy of a house that has, say, a smoke alarm, right? And the symptoms, the smoke alarm kind of ringing off. First, functional medicine would be like, okay, well, what's the smoke and the fire that's setting the alarm off? Like, where is there an environmental threat in the food you're eating? Is that, really inflammatory processed food kind of setting off your smoke alarm? Let's fix that and take that out of the picture. And, maybe there's some other elements of stressors and things like that in the environment that are creating the smoke alarm to go off. Fine, that's great. Remove all that. But then the smoke alarm is still being triggered to go off. So then we have to understand, well, why is it still, signaling? Because we've taken away the smoke and the fire. Why is it still going off? And then we start to understand that, well, it's set on a very sensitive setting so that it's going to go off even if it's not smoke wafting past, but a little bit of dust. So it's sort of really agitated and hyperreactive. So we have to kind of recognize that that's, the setting of our nervous system, say, and we have to help regulate it. So that's regulating the nervous system is sort of resetting the smoke alarm and kind of calming things down. But then we can go even deeper, because we'll start to ask, why is it set so sensitively, and why is it triggering all the time? And so then we can start to understand the story behind the sensitivity of our nervous systems. So why are we sort of set to kind of react so much to the world around us? And that's where we start to look into the deeper root causes, the trauma that you suggested. That's where we start to understand the story behind the body system. Like, I think for me, the most important thing for people to know is that their body is always responding intelligently and appropriately, and that any symptom or any manifestation of what we might call an illness or a disease is not representative of a broken system. It's representative of a perfectly normal, adaptive system that's responding intelligently to cues. And those cues might be coming from inside or outside, in terms of the outer environment or the inner environment. And the inner environment is, all of the things that trauma impact: our beliefs, our thoughts, our emotions, all of that. So that, I think, is sort of an important big picture look to understand why people are struggling. So it's not as simple as eating rubbish food and sitting in front of a screen all day. There's a lot more going on.
And any kind of top tips? I mean, I know it's not as simple as that, it's individualized, but where would be, if someone's listening to this and think, yeah, this sounds good, but give me some practical stuff here. Like, where would be some places to start?
Yeah, so I think you can kind of start with the basics, the kind of bottom layer of a pyramid, and those basics would be the foundations of what we do in functional medicine. So that would be supporting nutrition, healing the gut, because that's an important part of our the way we interact with the world. So we would look at clearing out, the processed foods, eating whole foods. A Mediterranean diet, for example, is probably the best kind of quick go-to diet that's the most supportive for all health conditions. So those sorts of basic foundational supports are the first step. The next step would be to look at the nervous system and start to notice when it's dysregulated. And by dysregulated, I mean it sort of kind of kicks off into a defense response. So we might notice when we, our heart's pounding a bit, or our breath is going a bit faster, or we feel a bit jittery, that's a sign that our nervous system's a bit dysregulated. So that's the next thing we can do for ourselves, is to start to do things that help us calm that down. It's like turning off the smoke alarm. It's settling the nervous system down. But then I would say the step after that is to start to maybe start to ask questions about why is my system so agitated? Why am I getting triggered? And that's when you can start to do deeper work. And that usually requires working with some sort of embodied therapist. So usually all of this information is held in the body, and the body tends to be our gateway to understanding, how do we begin to heal. And that's why I love, symptoms are our body's effort to communicate with us. So if we just sit there and engage with our body and listen to our symptoms, we can start to, and we engage with them with curiosity rather than with judgment, that is usually the door that opens to starting to heal our relationship with ourselves first by, just being attentive to our own bodies.
Yeah, with like with my stomach thing, it's like, okay, what am I not digesting here, and kind of like tuning into that. And
looking at how, that's a perfect example, looking at how the body speaks in metaphors. So what else am I not digesting? Could it have been an emotional experience that wasn't properly digested? So I do find that the body is very metaphoric and almost poetic in how it tries to express what's really going on for us. It's telling us exactly what's going on. Our mind can tell us all sorts of stories, but our body tells us the truth most of the time.
Yeah, I looked at all those layers with my stomach thing. So it's sort of on one layer, I was like, okay, what foods am I eating? It might be, inflammatory or kind of irritating. Okay, let's cut down the caffeine. That seems to be making it worse. Or, okay, let's do an experiment of non-dairy for a month and see if that helps, And then it's also like, okay, but, with digestion, fight or flight, so there's probably some trauma stuff here. Been working in Ukraine this year. That makes sense. Let's have a look at that. Also, am I just running fast a lot of the time? Okay, of course, I'm not digesting well if I'm in that fight or flight just from overwork and stress, it's not sleeping right. Let's look at that. And then the kind of deeper cut of like the metaphorical deep body listening, intuitive, like, okay, what's really going on here?
Exactly. It's sinking down deeper and deeper into all the layers. And as you were saying, it was stress. I think another kind of essential thing to think about is we kind of look at stress as negative, and I got to eliminate the stress or minimize the stress, and then everything will be okay. And if we kind of understand that stress is an important part of health. So if you look at a muscle, for example, the way to build a healthy, strong muscle, you need to stress it, right? You wouldn't have a healthy, strong muscle if you just rested it all the time. But so you stress it, but you also can't just keep stressing it. You need to rest it and allow, and in that resting phase is when the muscle regenerates and rebuilds back stronger and more resilient. So same goes for the whole of us. Stress is great and it builds a resilient, strong system, but we need to factor in that resting phase. And that's the modern person just doesn't do that. We just keep going and going. And so trying to build that into our day somehow, those periods of quiet, those periods of rest, and more deeper resourcing, for example, breath work or meditation, would really help our bodies understand that we're safe and it can actually generate some healing and building of resiliency rather than just continuing to defend.
Makes sense. I quite like this. I think it's called the barbell theory of health, which is something like that stress needs to be agentic. So like you choose that stress. Like I choose to go to the gym, I choose to have a cold shower, and it's not sustained. I go to the gym every 2 days or, a few times a week, and have a cold shower a few times a week. But if I was just having cold showers all day long, I'd be miserable, So it's like short and sharp and deliberate and controlled, and then with plenty of rest in between,
Yes.
Like a plenty of good. I always feel like the middle ground is the unhealthy place to live. It's like I want most of my life to be pleasant, just pleasantly easeful. Some of it to be deliberately very intense and hard, because otherwise you just get weak. And then some of it to be very pleasurable, but you can't have all of life like that because that's called an addiction. So it's a sort of, that's the kind of the barbell of my life I try to set up. A little bit of very difficult, a little bit of very pleasurable, and quite a lot of not too stressful and fairly pleasant.
Yeah, exactly. There's a balance to be struck, and resting physically is obvious that we know how to do that, but resting kind of psycho-emotionally, I think, is harder for us. That's where the pleasure and the addiction kind of comes in. Sometimes we reach for that in order to kind of quell any rising evidence of the psycho-emotional discomfort. So I think that that's an important element too, is to understand, how do we rest that part of us? How do we really kind of unwind and feel safe in all levels of us, not just the physical.
Nice talking with you, Lucie, and getting to know you a little bit. Where do people find out more? Where do people go if they want? Lucie, is it momentummedicine.care? Is that the one?
Yep, that's it. Yeah, or drluciewilk.com. Either one of those get you to the same
if people
site.
Google Lucie, IE, Lucie, Wilk, WILK, then it says Embodiment Medicine. Awesome. I like your logo. It's a nice little logo on your website there. That's well done. Cool. Well, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Mark. It's a pleasure.
Mark Walsh here. If you like that, you probably like embodimentunlimited.com and our app. So on both of these things, you can get a bunch of podcasts that aren't available here, some exclusive ones with some big names, some people you'll probably recognize that are over there. There's a copy of my book, PDF, my first book on embodiment, which seems to people like. I sold quite a few copies on Amazon, but there's a free copy there. What else is there? Loads of videos of me coaching embodiment, resources on trauma, on meditation, on yoga. And you can also chat to people without going on Facebook or any of that nonsense. So if you want to chat embodiment with people, that's there. And it's on the embodimentunlimited.com, all free, and the app available at the App Store and all that good stuff. So if you like this, do check those out.